either a broad sweep or a specific case study or element that they'd like to highlight. We ask them to either discuss what they've done or reflect how their project fits with the wider world of public history, about the challenges and opportunities and problems of collaborating, especially with universities or other institutions, about issues of funding, wider politics of their work. And following the presentations, we're going to open it for a conversation amongst the organisations, and as well as for the audience for questions and thoughts. So the speakers are going to introduce themselves, but before then, just a reminder of our brief guidelines for respectful conversation. So please be mindful that discussing histories can be challenging, emotive, and subjective, and that everyone's experience is different. Try to be clear when you're speaking to your own experience, and respectful when others are speaking to theirs. If you need support following a session, please reach out to Allison or Julia, and we will connect you with the appropriate resources. Please don't be racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, or otherwise prejudiced towards any marginalised group. If you're challenged in relation to this, please be mindful that the challenge is about the effects of your words and actions, not about your intentions, and please respond accordingly. No discriminatory questions or comments will be tolerated, and I will ask you to leave. When referring to people in the third person, please be mindful of any pronouns. If in doubt, try to use their name or a neutral they. It's best not to put someone on the spot by asking their pronouns in front of a group. And because this conference endeavours to bring together public historians from many different backgrounds, please try to avoid academic jargon or overly specialist professional language.
So, hi, my name is Kit Heyam, my pronouns are they, them, or he, him. To introduce myself, I wear many hats. I'm currently a lecturer in early modern literature, so not public history, at Queen Mary University, only up until Christmas. I'm also a writer, so my book, Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender, came out earlier this year. And I do a lot of public history projects specialising in queer and trans history and developing community partnerships with queer and trans communities. So one of my ongoing projects is a DIY memorialisation project called Rainbow Plaques, which empowers queer communities to make DIY rainbow plaques to mark spaces of queer significance in cities. What I'm going to be talking about today is a kind of my most recent public history project, and also one that's got an ongoing element after Christmas too, which is exciting. This is a project called Hidden Stories with the Royal Armouries in Leeds. Now, like a great many public history projects, this has a sort of really complex and arcane administrative history, and I did want to spend just a couple of minutes going through that because I think it is a helpful example of the kind of very complex, very contingent way in which some of these things can come about. So, Hidden Stories. It is funded by a bigger project called Leeds 2023. Leeds 2023 is this kind of endearing phenomenon which exists because Leeds got very close to being named European Capital of Culture for 2023 just before Brexit. Then they got excluded because of Brexit at the last minute. And so the City Council were just like, we'll run everything anyway, and we'll fund it or seek funding for it ourselves, which, as I say, endearing phenomenon. And they secured money from the National Lottery Heritage Fund for a pilot project as part of this, on the theme of hidden stories. They chose the name. We can critique the name if we want. I'm not going to do that right now. As those of us who are academics who think about this, we have been debating the term hidden history and how problematic it is for decades. Not going to rehash that here, but that's what they've called it. They've called it hidden stories. So they got this money for a pilot project from the National Lottery Heritage Fund at the end of January 2022. They then only had 3 months to run this pilot. So it was a sort of mad scramble for them to find people that actually do the work. And what happened in my case was they emailed me because they knew I ran walking tours of Leeds' hidden queer history. So basically, I think they Googled hidden queer history. And they basically said, okay, you do hidden things. Do you know any heritage organisations you could work with to do this hidden stories thing before May? And it happened coincidentally that I had been talking with the Royal Armouries about doing some activities for LGBT History Month 2023. And obviously this was a lot shorter of a timescale than we had anticipated, but they were giving us free money with the potential for it to lead to a larger NHLF bid. So we said yes. And so Hidden Stories at the Royal Armouries was one of several Hidden Stories projects going on around the city, all feeding into the future NHLF bid. So what we did is we focused around, oh, that's the Royal Armouries, that's what that looks like. We focused around one object in their collections, which is this sword, commissioned by the 18th century spy and diplomat, the Chevalier d'Eon. You can see fencing here, not with that sword, but. The Chevalier worked for the French king at the Russian and English courts, started living as a woman in London during the 1770s, and she commissioned this sword for her English friend, the lawyer George Kit. And the inscription reads, given by the Chevalier d'Eon to her old friend George Kit, Esquire, 1777. You will notice at this point I am using she/her pronouns for the Chevalier, and I'm using the feminized form of her title. That is deliberate. It is based partly on the self-identification on the sword itself, which is given by La Chevalier. If people want to talk about pronouns and methodology in trans history, it's one of my other fun hats that I wear and areas of interest, and yeah, I have to shout about that later. But for now, we wanted to use the sword to engage trans visitors to the Royal Armouries. My first concern, though, was to use some of the money that we'd got and some of the time that we got to make sure that the Armouries was a safe space for trans visitors, because as the person who was going to be the link between local trans communities and the museum, I felt an ethical responsibility to make sure that I was inviting them into a space where they wouldn't experience transphobia. And my initial meetings with the Armouries suggested that that was not a guarantee. So we gathered staff from all of the teams for a half-day trans awareness workshop, which I ran. I didn't say in the intro, I'm also a trans awareness trainer. That's another thing that I do freelance, so I did that. And that was really worthwhile. I think it increased awareness of sort of the practical issues, like how to refer to trans visitors respectfully, and the ethical and political states of doing trans history. And it did result in some concrete changes as well, like they now have some gender-neutral toilets at the Armouries, which was really essential to be able to invite trans groups in there to make sure they could go to the loop. So, together with the Armouries and with local artist Luna Morgana, we planned an event called Sword of Dale, a day of trans history at the Royal Armouries. And Luna and I marketed the event through targeted invitations to local trans groups, and that enabled us to reassure people from a trans perspective that they could trust the Armouries. There is, as many of you will know, there is not a lot of trust between trans people and institutions, full stop, especially historical institutions. I think the tendency of historical institutions like museums to erase trans history or to treat trans people tokenistically to launder their own reputations while refusing to make meaningful changes, that's kind of an assumed truth within trans communities. So that was the baseline that we were working to deconstruct. And so outreach from within the community, from me and Luna, was really helpful for getting people on board. And in the end, we had 25 people. We had a mix of ages, which was really great, and a mixture of kind of levels of familiarity with history and with the Armouries. The majority of people who came had not visited the Armouries before. So we started off with a welcome from the Armouries Community Liaison Officer, Tea and Pastries. This felt like a gimmick at the time. So he stood up at the beginning and he was like, "This is your museum." And actually, that was mentioned by so many people in the feedback. They felt really welcome. One of them said they felt treated like a VIP. So the significance of it, is not to be underestimated, I think. After this, they got a tour of the galleries. Here's some trans people looking at some stuff in the gallery. They had a look at the sword, and it's got some new trans-inclusive interpretation, which is very exciting. So we were able to get a new label printed for it. The old label was okay, actually, but the new label is better. They had a combat demonstration, they had a free lunch. Luna gave a talk about the Chevalier's life. We played a timeline jigsaw game. Here's me playing the timeline jigsaw game, where it's like we had to sort of put the events of her life in order on a washing line strung across the room. And in our evaluation, one of the participants commented particularly on the consequences of having an event about trans people facilitated by trans people, and they described Luna's presentation as especially enjoyable since it didn't shy away from her transness or misgender her, as often happens when people talk about historical trans people. And I think that demonstrates, that is not just a trans point, that is a point about the importance of engagement with marginalised communities when developing narratives of marginalised histories. And then the final output of the day was a zine telling the Chevalier's life story. So participants made individual zine pages, they compared make their own collages and then combine their own art with narratives of the Chevalier's life. And that's easy, they can access now online as well as existing in print forms in various zine libraries. And for me, zines with their roots in DIY and punk culture, they are an excellent route to co-production of historical narratives, I think, and to giving individuals a forum to respond creatively without thinking too much about the historical stakes of what they're doing or the rules of what they're doing. Respond creatively to the aspects of a history or an object that are meaningful to them. And yeah, you can find it online if you Google Royal Armouries Chevalier, you'll find it. So, I want to spend the last few minutes kind of reflecting on the outcomes and the challenges of the project. Now, as a pilot project, so this iteration of Hidden Stories had several aims, one of which was get more money from the National Lottery Heritage Funds, but beyond that, it aimed to tell the human story behind the object, and I think Luna's research on the Chevalier's life undoubtedly did that. It aimed to encourage revisits, and feedback was unanimous that yes, it had, that people weren't going back. It aimed to have a social impact, and here we had some really lovely positive comments. So people saying they often felt like they didn't fit in, and coming to this event made them feel part of their community. Someone said learning to be creative helped with their mental health. People said learning about the history was something they needed to do, that they found powerful, and that they felt like they were talking about things that mainstream society didn't talk about. And you can see that those last two comments in particular, there's comments about community and well-being and belonging, which maybe we expect. There's also a couple of comments about the value of a dry space, and I think, perhaps particularly for queer communities where socialising is very, very often organised around alcohol, actually museums and heritage have an overlooked niche in that area. So yeah, that was something participants commented really positively on. Now, I alluded to this earlier. Key challenge for the event was the incredibly short time frame that we were doing this in. And I want to just tease out a few of the consequences of that now. First of all, that meant that we had a lot of very, very restricted time for research and planning. More seriously, it caused real problems for Luna as a disabled artist. Okay, so being unable to adequately space her working days out, which she would normally have done, being unable to pace herself, that caused her chronic health conditions to flare up. And that underlines, I think, the fact that the conditions under which we are often asked to work on public history projects are not accessible conditions. They are really seriously harmful to disabled people, and that was a real impact for Luna specifically. And then thirdly, and also seriously, the lack of time led to a kind of lack of opportunity for Luna and I to co-develop aims and expectations for the project with the Armouries. Now, as someone who is a trans person and who also does a lot of public history facilitation, I have been on both sides of the community public history project process, and this might be familiar to anyone who's from a marginalised group and works in a museum. So I've been like the person reaching out to communities on behalf of the museum. I've also been the community being reached out to. And one key pitfall that I have observed from both of those sides is you get into a situation where each side feels like it's doing the other a favour. And that is so not conducive to goodwill. So the museum feels like we are magnanimously giving this marginalised group a voice, and the marginalised group is like, I am generously providing you with free labour. And so no goodwill exists in that. Only resentment exists, especially if either side has problems or if there's any conflict. It's just conducive to resentment. And I think taking time to make sure that everyone is on the same page about expectations and aims and responsibilities and roles, that can help enormously with this, but being forced to work under time pressure really obstructs that kind of co-development. And in this case, I think the project this problem kind of collided with a lack of awareness of the power dynamics in our collaboration on the part of the Armouries. So Luna and we worked many more hours than we were being paid for, partly because we hoped it would result in more funding and therefore more work for us, partly because we cared a lot about whether the project succeeded. Trans history is emotionally and politically important to me. It's important as a source of solidarity and community. It's important as a way to combat the transphobic narrative that we are a recent phenomenon, and that we're a trend or a new threat. That is not conducive to a healthy work-life balance, and I think awareness of that was really lacking. What this problem also collided with was a lack of awareness on the Armouries' part of the fragility of trans people's trust in institutions, particularly the fact that trans people we are an over-researched community. Okay, so everyone wants to work with and scrutinise trans people. If we want to access healthcare, we are scrutinised enough, but then that's also kind of what happens whenever we engage with institutions or academics. And that kind of that reached its lowest point, I would say, when we were in a meeting and one staff member said, oh, the point of this project was to research whether we could work with trans communities. And so, in that one sentence, Luna and I went from subject to object, right? So we went from the researchers to the research. And museums and any institution working with marginalised groups, and especially with groups that have been historically denied autonomy and humanity in research projects, really, really need to be sensitive to this dynamic in order to build effective working relationships. So, just in the last minute, what is happening next? Very happily, the project was successful. We've got a further grant. We're going to be using that for a community exhibition. And that's going to be building on a resource that I co-developed with my colleague James Daybell at the University of Plymouth, following a project that we did with the B&A here in London and the Vassar Museum in Stockholm. It's called Gendering the Museum, a toolkit, and it's a guide aimed at museum and heritage staff to diversify gendered representation in museums in a really holistic way, so not just thinking about curation, but also thinking about what it means to gender spaces in practical ways, what it means to gender your events program, stuff like that. But it includes a methodology for kind of finding hidden gender stories by looking at the life cycle of an object, thinking about its making and the way that the sourcing of its materials impacted gender dynamics in the society those materials came from, stuff like that. So we're going to be implementing that to make this community exhibition. This is an open access PDF. We don't have web hosting for it yet, but if anyone wants it, let me know. You're more than welcome to take a look. But yeah, I will finish there. Thank you very much.
So before we start, so my name is Kiran Sahota. I'm now a social historian. I know, really fancy. I started off as a citizen historian, but before that, I'm 29 plus some numbers, so I don't like to reveal my age. Before that, when did I learn about history? It was year 9 in school, so I don't know how it works now. So coming into history for me and be called now a social historian or woman leading in military history has been fascinating for me, but it also has its downfalls. So we're here to talk about my new project, Indian Women and War Project. Can you do the next slide? Which, when we think about war narratives, we never think of women, especially Indian women. Hands up for people that study history or are academics. Who even knew that Indian women in saris could serve? Yeah, there's a couple. Well, can you believe it? The social historian is now the expert, and that is said by Dr. Yasmin Khan at Oxford University. I know. And why am I so pleased about this? This is just how I speak. Why am I so excited about this? Is because this is the first ever project that's been funded by National Natural Heritage Fund. You're supposed to normally have a collaborator or government partnership. And the first time it's been done, it's my 3rd national project with them. We don't have big money, no 100,000 or anything like that. It's capped at 58,000, that's what we've got. 90% of that goes on young people and learning. So it's the first of its kind to ever be funded. And I never thought that I would be the expert. And why I'm so excited is because we can go national. When I started in this, just to give you a little bit of background why I'm so excited about this, is because I am British Indian and my grandparents who raised me couldn't read or write, and whether that's Punjabi in their own language or whether it was English. And they were called over to Britain when the English were in India saying that, do you want to earn some money, you need to rebuild England for us. And so they settled in East London, but I'm a traitor because now I'm West London. But my grandparents are past, so you know that we've gone through all that. You know, why you're not leaving East London instead of West London. But I know it's gangs, I know. But anyway, so I was so excited. When I started in history, I started in looking at Indian military history through a female lens, but men's history. And would you believe it? Men come and the room will be full. And then they get disappointed, why am I teaching the history? Because somebody once said to me, what's your schooling? And I said, year 9 history. And he said, no, what makes you able to come to Oxford to teach us? And I was like, well, schooling. Well, then I reeled off a list who my mentors were, and that is Dr. David Onisi, Dr. Yasmin Khan, the list goes on, Dr. Santanu Das. A bit like Educating Rita by Bill Russell. That was I only passed in English literature. But the reason I talk about this is because I am a working class. And I went into corporate just to make money. I come from teaching, I've worked with gangs, done all that, violent crime. I got into job after job because in our culture, I don't know if it's changed now, but in growing up in our cultures, you can never leave a job without having a job. And if you're not going to go into higher education, then you better make sure that you get a job. I hated my university experience, and nobody knew what to do with me in university. And I suffered racism at university, and I never thought I'd be in a space like this. So to find pictures like this, so when I was like, after my second project, National Heritage Fund came knocking on my door. Hi Kiran, where do you think it's going to go? And I was like, where do you think what's going to go? When? How? What? And they were like, do you have an idea? And I was like, okay. My past project reached heights that we never thought. We were invited by the royal family to be at Westminster Abbey for the First World War centenary. We had mass celebrity fans, where do I get this project? But it was a co-creation, and behind me was standing a man, which I had no problem with. But now they saw Kiran Sahota in her own light. What catapulted that audience then, I started looking at letters. Indian men were comparing European women to Indian women. And if you're a woman just now, this is how you're supposed to look like, this is what you're supposed to do, this is what's sexy, this is what's not sexy. And, I remember going why can't we just teach history? Why does it always have to be like this? But I can't imagine in 1914 to 1918, the periods I was studying, why are women being compared? And how are Indian women still not being educated when men were sending money, but there was no response? So when National Heritage came knocking, I'm more First World War. But I found images like this. This is not the full image, but I do have it when we can do a show and tell downstairs. But these are women, and they've got saris. But what you'll see is their saris are tucked up, and they've got no shoes. They've got no shoes, barefoot, sorry. But here, that is oil. And what is this? It's an RAF helicopter. And these two are American soldiers. And then I knew I had an idea, because I'm already open up collections. I'll tell you about the other work after. But I opened up collections for Army, Air Force and Navy. And I was like, well, the Army, Air Force and Navy must know this history. They didn't know their history. My community, because I work with domestic violence unit, kids in care. I work with a lot of, where English is not first language, because of my background in education. And I work with a lot of gang members, with the children who are victims of gangs and cultural wars, or whatever you want to call it nowadays. When they have no outlet, we try and get them in a project just to make sure that they open their minds to other things. You don't have to be Salvation, by the way, to know this history or like this history. But it connected me, because these women look like my nanny, my maternal grandmother. And I was also I'm also a working carer. And I was like, she had no voice, and she suffered downstairs, we talk about partition. She's never really spoken about anything like this. And then my granddad said, my nana, maternal grandfather, he was like, women like this were always in the villages. And I was like, big thing in India is about colorism and caste. And so to see dark-skinned women in photographs with no history, there's nothing in the background saying what date, where they were. I just know this because I opened collections for armed forces. So I did a bit of digging. That's where Dr. Kit came in, because I was like, what do I do with these photos? Can you show me that photo? And then we see these women in saris. Again, this is not the full image, but what are they doing by the water? What year is this? So I moved from First World War to Second World War, where there was enough evidence. And they were called the Rings, the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service Rings. And they were created in 1944, and they were a branch of the Indian Navy at that time, because they needed support. But what came before that, I haven't got the slides, but I've got pictures because I'm limited on time, was the Women Auxiliary Corps India, which is the WACI. And it's modelled on the ATS service, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, which we know the late Queen Elizabeth II was in. And so this, in 1942, when the WACI was formed, that covered Army and RAF. It was the first time in history, this is why I get really excited, that Indian women could actually sign up for service, but outside of nursing roles. And I didn't want nursing roles in there, so this is why I got the funding. Show us proof, get the funding. I showed the funding. There was not much written, and there's still not much written. 90% of my exhibition has come from private collections. Now this is where I love men, because heroes, and this is it, and I've funny this, and money was so easy to come by, private donors. You want to talk about a hero, you got to talk about a man. So I took that, and they kind of loved towards the end, the second project, when I was saying, but it's about women, and I'm going to put the women's letter in, so I kind of got my way. And private donors are different to Heritage Lottery Fund, because they really want to return, but history has no return, because I still don't get paid. But that's why I've got 50,000 other jobs, because I'm a citizen historian, and I don't have an MA and PhD. And I'll talk about the differences real quick there, later on, just at the end. But why this was funny about men giving private collections is because I put it on Twitter. Now, I'm not really on social media because I am just one person. I'm the PR, the administration, the chair, the receptionist, could you hold? No, I'm really on because I'm busy. I'm also a carer. I'm working full time, and I'm just stressed out. And then I put emails. Yes, I'll do that in a minute. But what men done is that, we wrote something on here. We've got pictures. And I said, well, what's the cost? He said, there's no cost. And men started giving pictures. As long as you credit us. I said, is that all you want? And he said, yeah, just credit, because we've seen your past work. Because now I've worked with Love Island stars, and I'll talk about the podcast later, everything's on my website. I know I don't watch Love Island, but I had to pretend I watch Love Island. Because they said, hello, hi, it's Amber Gill calling. But this is the thing. And then when I showed them this picture, but the difference between this image and the first image is these women were privileged. And we don't talk about these privileged women. So the other women were exploited. And I've made YouTube videos if you can't get to the exhibition. They were really exploited by their fathers, the brothers, the village people, if their fathers and brothers had gone off to war. For these women, you had to sign up for the Wakai and the Ring. You had to learn to read and write. And they came from cities, if you know where India is, like Delhi and Calcutta. You couldn't come from the villages like the other women. These women were registered. The other women were registered. They also made brothels for the other women, but they would never use brothels here. But what's the difference between, so the Wakai was made up of 2/3 of British women, British Anglo-Indian women, as well as women from Britain being sent over to India. And the reason is because they modelled it on the ATS, they wanted some sort of unit. Now this really bothered the men, because this is where you see British women and Indian women get together and then say, actually, you're saying that we can't have the same rank, now watch us make a unit, and we marched forward. And so we talk about segregation. Women's history in general, whether it's British women, black women, Indian women, it's really overlooked. But to hear this in context and say, oh my God, so they had to come forward. And apparently why I use this image is because men were talking that if these women come on the Navy base, because they had to do the training on the ship, so they never went off to war, they're going to be a distraction, but men are always distracted, so why don't you concentrate on doing your work and let the women do their work? And what it was noted in the papers, because of partition, what we heard downstairs, in 1946 they were disbanded, and had this unit carried on, especially the Rins, where it's made up 2/3 of Indian women, compared to the Wakais, where it's mostly British Indian women, they would have been a force to be reckoned with. And that just blew my mind. And what's it? Oh, sorry. I'll just have
3 more minutes.
Okay, let me just do the next slide. And what blew my mind is that, so what's the link with the communities that I work with today, and why should we care? Because if young people are not going back to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, their home countries, they don't even speak the mother tongue anymore. Now, it was knocked into us. If you have to be raised old school, you have to learn your mother tongue. So I'm fluent in Punjabi. I know Hindi a little and speak it a little. I kind of understand it but cannot speak it. That's why I get translators in. So Kilani Sen was part of the Rins, and that's Margaret Cooper who led the Rins, and she was invited. So we wrote to the Queen before she passed back in the summer, but we haven't got a reply now. We know why, because she might have been sick. And I'm not doing the jesting now. I'm just speaking openly because she was a second officer, not even a first officer, a second officer to come over, invited to Buckingham Palace. She had to do the training, the Wrens, there was also the British model, the Wrens, as well as the Rins, to teach Kalani Sen, and she took that back to India. So this is really this project where we see women leading, and I'm just going to, because I've got a couple of minutes, talk about the downsides in this. So although it seems like, oh yes, Kiran's doing this, X, Y, Z, now we're on YouTube, and I brought in a BBC 100 woman, Sharon Daliwal, to make the films, because people often put us, I've reached my limit now. I can't afford an MA or PhD, so I'm not going to get any any further. I don't have a book deal, television deal, or any of that. So we also get exploited, and we don't talk about citizen historian. Can you come here and speak? And then you find institutions, not even just academic, but normal organisations, would take that and would take that and would take that and would take that. And would you believe it, my mentors, I'm now teaching, the student has become the teacher. They're not exploiting me, what they're saying is we saw this and we're pushing you. And now, like I said before, citizen historian, there's a limit. So to even come here and present, I've not been back in, I do guest lecturing now, some people that say, oh, calm guest lecture, and I love it. But with my own experiences, doors were shutting, and it never really came this easy. First project and second project, they got denied and overlooked, because how dare a woman come into a man's world? And what happened is, what I speak to a man when he talks about my schooling, is that you have the privilege to be there because you've got the money that I haven't got, and you rank us for being working class, and that we're destroying this narrative or disrupting this narrative as I've been told, you know, how dare a woman talk about these things. But if you've had the chance to do it, this is to academics, especially male academics, you knew this history, you chose not to do it, and now you're getting angry because private collection, because most of this has been sold off. So you'll never find copies of original wings or whackers. It's been sold off. A guy from America, someone from Australia, someone from Britain, here you go, here's the picture. But I also touch on two other stories before my time runs out. Princesses, how they use their privilege. Princess Catherine Dilip Singh, sister of Princess Sophia Dilip Singh, and Princess Indira Devi of Kapurthala, that she was on the cover of Vogue, and we don't talk about these women. For years we've never seen these images, and this is why I get so hyped up. Like, here I am presenting to students, is because when this history isn't hidden, it's just being pushed aside because it's not important. The money goes where it's male narratives, and that's where you see a lot of the National Heritage Fund. I don't know what's after this project, but all I know is right now, Beyonce released a new album. We're calling it the Lemonade album, like the past, because people questioned whether I would still have it after what we went through during lockdown. And it was a dark period because we nearly got shut down. And I said, no, I'm back this summer. We launched at the House of Lords. We went on HMS President. I'm the first British woman that's opened up collections for Army, Air Force and Navy. I also took children to Commonwealth Day at Sandhurst, and it's never been done before. If we all work together, you can actually have fun learning. And if we all work together, don't worry about where budgeting happens. I know what I bring to the table now when I look at collaborations. What is it exactly that you're bringing to the table? Because I got this. And that's like statistical, but men speak like that all the time, and we don't check them. But when a woman does it, we check them real quick and say, no, snap back, and you can't talk about this. So that's my work, and I'll be downstairs later on or here for questions. But that's me in a nutshell.
Cool. Hi everyone, I'm Perry. I'm a columnist at Tribune Magazine, and I'm also a project coordinator at the Young Historians Project.
I'm Tionne. I'm also a project coordinator at the Young Historians Project, and I'm also a PhD history student, so that's kind of relevant to what we're going to talk about today.
I've got flex. You might have to. But no, so as the Young Historians Project, we are a collective of young people of African and Caribbean descent, looking at widening engagement in history. I'm sorry, the effects are going to be persistent throughout. So yeah, we're looking to widen participation in Black British history. We were originally formed in 2015 out of the History Matters conference, and what happened there was we were discussing the low rates of enrolment among students of African and Caribbean descent in history, and I think the statistic is something like it's the third most unpopular subject among young Black students. So out of that statistic, the Young Historians Project was born to try and widen participation. So we believe that Black British history, or what has come to be known as Black British history today, has been largely underserved in the curriculum. Usually it's been the case that once Black History Month rolls around, Black history is really in vogue, it's really popular, and that tends to be just for that month, and then November rolls around, see you later, Black history doesn't exist anymore, that sort of thing. So we want to widen that participation. So yeah, we're looking to recruit young people. Obviously it says 16 to 25, it's not a hard age cap. It's not a hard age cap. We do have some people that are a bit older, but generally we are looking at that younger age group. And we're looking to address narratives that are part of mainstream British history and narratives that exclude Black British histories from public discourse. And we also want to contribute to public history and importantly, engage with communities in creating our histories.
Yeah, so as Parris said, one of the main things that we do is we recruit. A really key thing to sort of say about the Young Historians Project is that it is an entirely collaborative organisation. While Perry and I are coordinators, that just means that we have to organise things like our emails, like when we meet, just all of the sort of bits and bobs that go on behind the scenes. But in terms of the way that we create projects, the way that we collaborate, every member is on the same level, everyone's allowed to contribute their ideas. We like to sort of nurture people's skills, so as we put in this slide, when young people come to us, one of the first things we ask is, what do you want to get out of this? So we have young people who come from a lot of different backgrounds, people who are in university, people who may have gone on to do full-time jobs and just want to do history as like a fun thing to do outside of those hours. So we do like to focus on what we can do for them as well as what we can create together. So as we put here, one of the main things we do is we research, obviously. So we use a lot of archival sort of materials, so we do archival training. We teach people how to sort of put together the research, how to sort of work together to bring an output out of that as well, for example. We also run all of our social media via our members, so Perry runs our Facebook group, I believe, the most popular one. I run the Twitter account, we have people who run their Instagram accounts, and again, everyone has access to them, everyone can sort of volunteer to do that. And as well as that, we do make documentaries for some of our projects. For the Black Liberation Front project, which we did in like 2017, that at the end of that project, we had a documentary which is available on our website for free. And we also created a sort of short documentary series for our African Women project. So we want our members as well to learn those skills. So we sat down with people like the Rainbow Collective, who worked through with our organisation to create our documentary series. So our members had the opportunity to decide what was going to be in the documentaries, to take part in the interviews, and then to edit them at the end to say, this is how we want this to look. And then obviously project management is one of the key things with us because we are all young people, we all have to learn how to run a project. So again, that comes with time management, with being able to sort of advocate for your ideas, and to be able to speak with everyone. And then I think if you press the space bar. Yep, the main thing also is that it's a safe and supportive space to network for our young people. So as Perry said, the rates of Black historians in the UK are really low. For example, I believe it's less than 1% of all professors of Black history in the UK.
I'm pretty sure that's just a key.
Yeah, less than 1% of professors or professional historians in the UK are people of African or Caribbean heritage. So very sort of rare in the UK to find Black historians. So with young people, what we do is we create a space where if they want to go on and study for a master's or PhD or even just do an undergrad, they have a community of Black people who also have studied history or are interested in history. So yeah, that's one of the other main things for us.
So this picture that you can see on the slide is it's an advert for our most recent project, which came out last year. We've also got the shirts on with the logo on the back as well. So it was titled A Hidden History, African Women in the British Health Service, and essentially the reason or the rationale behind the project was that often in narratives of Black British contribution to healthcare, it often centres on Caribbean women, and obviously the big one, Mary Seacole, for example, who gets wheeled out every Black History Month to sort of say, you know, here you go. So we wanted to branch out a bit, and for the project we interviewed, I want to say about 50 different African women who are involved in healthcare, all the way from people running sickle cell clinics, and which is a particular affliction affecting the Black community in Britain, all the way to Black people involved in mental health. And we produced a documentary, we produced an ebook, all sorts really, and I think we'll get onto it later, but we also produced a mural series. So yeah, just a bit more about the project. It was a sort of grand narrative focusing on not just contemporary African women, but stretching back to the historical aspect of the involvement of African women in British healthcare. And it's really an understudied history, and almost everyone we spoke to when we were doing the consultation for it was sort of like, African women? Like, why are you doing that sort of thing? So, I mean, it was a sort of self-evident over the course of planning that this was sort of necessary project to take part in.
And as obviously as the theme of this conference, we do a lot to contribute to public history and engage with the community. So as Parris has said, we sort of met with these African women who had been in the British Health Service, so we have really good sort of intergenerational conversations with them that aren't just about their sort of role as nurses or as whatever else they did in the health service. They've actually become really like great sort of, I would say, mentors of people that we can go back to and say, hey, this is what we're up to now, would you like to come along to our event? And they're always really keen. So again, it's been another way for us to sort of nurture the community and create sort of cohesiveness amongst us. And as well as that, we do a lot of events. So this one at the bottom is a public event that we did online. It was free to access, and I believe it's still on YouTube. And it was called Black History Matters. Deanna and myself are at the bottom there, and then we're with Martha Sherwood, who's done a lot of history of Black British history. She's written a book on Claudia Jones, she's written about the West African Students' Union. So again, not only are we looking at our specific Black community, we're making connections with historians who have written accessibly on our work. And Claudia Thomason is also an up-and-coming PhD sort of historian. These are ways that we've sort of engaged and contributed to public history. And again, these things are all available online, free to access, and so it's really easy to sort of interact with them. And in some photos at the top there, we've got Dame Elizabeth Anglanu, who was involved in the African Women Project, and then obviously her interviews and some pictures from that day, which is really great.
Yeah, just to add, often the process was that we were invited to people's homes to interview them, and that just that process is quite intimate, and there's a certain level, especially as young people, there's a certain level of respect, especially when dealing with community elders. I think that part of the process was probably the best bit, just that one-to-one interaction. I say one-to-one, it's about three of us, but that intimate interaction with community elders, I think, was a really positive part of the project. So this is one of the murals that we had commissioned. It's our most recent mural. It's in Charing Cross Hospital. You can go and have a look at it. So what the idea was that we wanted to sort of celebrate the contribution of African women, both historical and contemporary, to British healthcare. So as you can see, there are a range of different African women in different uniforms based on not only their occupation but the time, and also we made it a point to have at least one African woman in traditional clothing on the mural. The colour palette, we get asked a lot, interestingly, about why we chose the background, and the rationale behind that was essentially it represented shift work, so the darkness represents the night shift working all the way through to the day, and during the consultation, because before we do the murals we have to speak to the people involved, and I think that was something, the theme that we got out of it was, waking up at the crack of dawn and going to bed at silly hours, waking up, and so that colour scheme I thought it just looks nice as well. So that was one of our murals. That's the most recent one. This mural here is the previous mural. It's at Bath. This has an interesting story behind it because it was a very, very long process, and I think provided us with some useful sort of lessons in doing this kind of work. So the main issue here comes with Princess Sahai. She's holding a newspaper saying Bath welcomes, etc., etc., etc. But originally the idea was because Princess Sahai was active in the sort of protest against the invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini. And originally the newspaper said, hands off Ethiopia, and they got back to us and they said,
no.
Could we maybe not do that? And we that was a big point of contention, and eventually we did have to change it if we wanted to get the mural approved, and that just, it's one of the issues that comes with doing this kind of history, that you do run into those political questions, and when you're in dialogue with institutions as young people, the power dynamics are incredibly, sorry I'm going over time, the power dynamics are incredibly skewed in their favour. I mean, sometimes, as a young person, I get anxious just picking up the phone to call someone, let them know, go into the NHS and say, I really want to have this, so that's just something we need to take into account.
Yeah, so following on from what Parris said, obviously there are a lot of challenges that we face as an organisation, so we've just got some quick ones here. So first and foremost, we're made up of young people, as I said. Young people have a lot of things going on in their lives, so it tends to be difficult to get people to all meet at the same time, or to make sure everyone can, give the right amount of time to the projects, get people to come back every 2 weeks or every week to come and talk about the projects. And then also funding. The National Lottery Fund has been mentioned a lot here. That is where we get our funding from, because we do find that, as Parris said about the Hands Up Ethiopia thing, sometimes political organisations are not keen to get involved with their work because it's a little bit radical, I guess. And then lack of commitment from other organisations. As Parris said, we're very popular in October. Everyone wants to do Black History Month events. However, it's very quiet for the rest of the year, so we are really sort of looking for, whenever we engage with our organisations or institutions, we want that to be a lasting connection. We want them to come back and say, 6 months' time, what are you guys up to? How can we support that? And just sort of really be able to utilise those connections in a way that does contribute to changing the sort of landscape of public history. And then finally, discrimination. Obviously, the nature of what we do is very black, and I think in the current sort of political climate, it can be a tricky sort of subject sometimes. For example, when we did our launch for our African Women project, we had an online launch, so we had a huge sort of Zoom webinar that we gave tickets to, and one of the things we had to consider was, do we have people in place to kick people out once the sort of racial abuse starts and people start trolling our chat and things, and also because we are young people, we have to be really careful about safeguarding people and to make sure we don't put them in a position that they are sort of out there in the open to be abused by whoever's online. So that's also something that we have to consider. Perry and I are young people, so also it's a learning process for us. So again, yeah, it's just one of those things that we are growing together as an organisation and as individuals.
One thing I will add, just conscious of time, another massive issue that we face is exploitation, just as young people. And I'm not going to go into the specific case study, but we have had instances where big companies come along or big historians come along and they say, oh, I'm working on this, would you like to be involved, would you like to do some research? And then by the time it comes out, we've not been credited, our work has been, our research has been taken, our name for our project was taken, and we're just here like, what can we do? So I think a lot of it comes back to that, the issue of power dynamics, and a lot of people see a group of young people and like, right, easy, I can get some nice cheap or even free labour, and that's just something that we're constantly aware of.
I think that's it.
I think that's it.
I'm Allison McKibban. I'm a researcher here at Birkbeck, a PhD student with the Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters team. I am also the organizer with Julia of this conference, so I also work as, I do my PhD full-time, but I also work part-time to help fund my PhD. And I work for the History Network that Julia has been leading, which has been an amazing experience, and obviously thank you all for that. I'm with the Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters project. As it says up there, it's a research project that's exploring the role of medicine and psychiatry in sexual violence. And ultimately, we see sexual violence as a global health crisis that needs to be addressed both through research but also through public engagement. And our idea here is to promote human health through providing unprecedented insights into the role of medicine and psychiatry in understanding, interpreting, treating, prosecuting, and preventing sexual violence. And here we really want the emphasis to be that sexual violence is a global issue that has to be addressed not only in the United Kingdom but beyond. So we are a PI led by Professor Joanna Burke here at Birkbeck in the History Department, along with a few postdocs, PhD students, and our public engagement coordinator, Cora, who's going to talk at the end of the presentation as well. And we have more than 30 affiliated scholars from all over the UK, but also globally, who contribute to our research. So, SHaME's big research project, this is Joanna's project, is a global history of sexual violence, which she's writing a book on. She's just put out another history of sexual violence, but this one will focus on medicine and psychiatry, which will come out at the end of our project sometime in the next couple of years. And then we have lots of projects, obviously, from all the affiliated researchers. Mine's in the bottom left corner. I work on how law interacts with the sexual violence Native American women face in the United States. So, more relevant to the public history aspect of this, because our project is very interdisciplinary. It is predominantly historians, but we also have anthropologists and sociologists on our team. we're all focused around how do we make our research accessible to the public, but not just that, how do we create genuine engagement beyond research? So we do quite traditional academic things like book launches, although we did throw one for a fiction book recently, which was new territory for us. Academic conferences, but also we're currently commissioning a film. We've done master classes and writing workshops, both with academics, but also survivors of military sexual trauma. We've hosted policy forums, most recently on the crisis of HIV/AIDS for gay men. And we have some podcasts from both the event I'm going to talk about today, but also more broadly. We have an artist in residence coming, which I'm very excited about. And finally, what I'm going to talk about today is the series of festivals we've thrown, which we only have 2 confirmed. The first, which happened in London last year, and the second, which is in Rio de Janeiro this weekend, which is where most of our team is right now. And then we're hoping to have one eventually in Glasgow. We've been approached to hopefully get some extending funding to work on that. So, I want to talk today about Shameless, which is a festival of activism we threw last year in collaboration with Women of the World Foundation. It was a one-day festival of activism that confronted sexual violence, and it brought together academic researchers, artists, and activists. It's actually a 2-year collaboration. We are Wellcome Trust funded, our project, and this is follow-on funding, which means we got an additional pot of money to throw this festival. Women of the World is a girls' empowerment charity, a women and girls' empowerment charity, but that focuses a lot on bringing art and artists into the process of activism to advocate on behalf of women. And their ideas came about that we wanted to bring together diverse communities of survivors, and that this would be a celebration for survivors of sexual violence that also pushed forward activism. What I'm going to chat for a few minutes with you guys about today is something I think is really important, which is safeguarding and the way we think about it in public history. So this festival brought together researchers, medical professionals, legal professionals, artists, and activists for talks, performance, workshops, how-to clinics, and wellness spaces. And the purpose ultimately, what was stated, is to confront and change attitudes towards sexual violence, to share ideas, and to imagine a rape-free world. We wanted the attendees to leave the festival with essential tools and knowledge that supported their recovery beyond just this idea of all being there together. So, this is just a few of the panels that were put on throughout the day by our team. Joanna did How to Create Rape-Free Worlds, which was an amazing panel. These are all of our plenary panels were viewable and are viewable on YouTube, but these workshops were really where the public history comes in. So we had a Me Too workshop that was done by an outside organization we commissioned, but I ran a zine workshop with a zine artist. It actually ended up to be a different zine artist. But it looked at kind of the history of sexual violence and how we use art to communicate. And that was obviously interactive, and then we published a zine from that. History Investigators was my personal favorite, which was run by one of my colleagues. We did a timeline very similar to what Kit showed in their presentation, and we had people try and put instances of activism against sexual violence onto the timeline in order. People were massively wrong, including me. I was a participant. And I think it really illuminated how both recent and old the history of activism against sexual violence are, but how we confuse where we are in that chain. And finally, my favorite plenary panel, which was a collaboration by Tanaka Mishi and Dr. George Severs on our team, along with Ben Hurst, which talked about male survivors and their experiences, which almost entirely gets left out of the conversation. So, safeguarding. Oh, I didn't know it had an effect. Safeguarding is not just about who's going to show up. I think we think about safeguarding our attendees at festivals or events, but we were worried about safeguarding our presenters. We invited survivors of sex trafficking to present. We had people whose families were after them for talking publicly about the violence they had endured. And we also invited a litany of people who come from different background intersections, but maybe most notably, this was right as the press is exploding with gender-critical feminists, we'll use that term, who are attacking trans presenters. And we wanted to make sure that with multiple, trans organizations and trans presenters coming, that it was a safe space for them. Also ourselves, we're all, not all, most of us are survivors of sexual violence planning this conference was exhausting, and our research is exhausting. So we needed to know how to take care of that. So this is from an institution, whose name is up there, that I took safeguarding training from. This was a very good institutional safeguarding training, in my opinion. But what does it say? It says we safeguard these people, and any other people outside of that, it is not our legal obligation to safeguard. I get that. But when we thought about safeguarding, we wanted to have a bit of a more complicated conversation, because I don't think it's so straightforward. So while we talked about similar things like capacity to consent to share information, and making safeguarding documents, we were more concerned with making safeguarding personal. And we turned to the Survivors Trust, which is a great organization, who trained us over the course of 2 sessions on how to take safeguarding to the personal level. So we need to know that safeguarding is focused on the individual you're trying to protect, rather than on meeting legal obligations of it. And in this, we need to take account of the individual's choices and requirements, and all of those people who are involved in the incident or the event we're talking about. So their views, wishes, feelings, and beliefs. And from this, this is just a slide from the training. We talked about trauma-informed approaches. Where does trauma come from? How is it created? Internalizing and externalizing behaviors, and things like identifying triggers. And I just really like this slide because I thought it broke down kind of what we ask ourselves about triggers. Would highly recommend the Survivors Trust as well. We also talked about grounding techniques. So what do we do when someone is at the festival and is triggered, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about as a researcher. Getting into the middle of that is intimidating for sure, but this is just a cool resource. And then from the training, we also talked about things that relate to disclosures of sexual violence. So all of these are different training materials we had that were presented that talk about what do you do when someone at the festival walks up to you and says, I'm a survivor of sexual violence, and starts telling you their story. And for me, this is where safeguarding myself and my teammates became particularly interesting, but also to make sure that we're providing them with support. We're not licensed therapists, and I would never claim to be. So I promise we did not support people on our own, because that definitely would have been unethical. Instead, this is what we did for the festival. We started by asking the Survivors Trust, what do we do? How do we make this safe? And we also we were lucky to have one of the ethics board on our team, who was very helpful in thinking all of this through. So we started with on-site support. We had trained psychotherapists and counselors on-site who were in private rooms able to talk to any of the 600 attendees who came to the festival. We also had safeguarding wardens, both from WOW, which is Women of the World, and also from our organization, who created this lovely crib sheet, which was much longer, but I just took a snapshot of, that kind of told anyone affiliated with the event, if someone comes up to you and says something you're concerned about, here are some steps to take, and it explains the categories as well. We then also had session signposting, so every session we were explicit about the topics ahead of time that would be discussed. When you're dealing with something like sexual violence, it's just essential. And then we had on-site security. We were very worried about the physical security of our presenters. They were all women who were our security officers, something we were very adamant about, and WOW was particularly helpful in sourcing. Because there is so much that comes with gender when it comes to sexual violence, and we wanted to make sure there was never a man physically removing a woman from a room if it came to that. And by the way, it did not. No one was physically removed. And the code of conduct, which I'm going to talk about for just a minute, and then trained photographers. So when you're having a conference like this, it's great. We can get your consent to take your pictures, which we're not. But at a festival like this, we had a specially trained photography team that only took pictures that are unidentifiable of the attendees and only of presenters. Sorry, Katie. So this was our code of conduct that we ended up coming to. And it's long, but what I really just want to highlight is that we wanted to consider the disparate power structures that are impacting people in different ways. We listed our values of empathy, generous intention, survivor language, diverse triggers, that people could leave as they wanted, but we also listed resources like therapists, survivors' trusts, helplines, and having a chat with one of us. We had active actions to take, so people needed to commit to reporting something if they saw it, having open minds, and keeping people's privacy. But also we were explicit that there would be no toleration of offensive language about gender identity, expression, or mental health. No photos would be taken by participants of other participants. And no one could give sexually explicit language about their assault to other people, because that is putting a burden on those people as well. We required people to read this when they signed up, but we also printed it in the program and reiterated it in the sessions, and that's available online. These are just pictures because, yay, it's me, because I couldn't take a picture of anyone else, from our sessions throughout the day, and it was just really good fun. So we've had some outputs from this on YouTube. We've had blogs, podcasts, a zine, and a short film by teen survivors, which is really cool, all available on our website. And a lot of collaborations came out of it, both with survivors who we met that day and panelists who we didn't know as a team. So from the public history research perspective, it's definitely been exciting. I'll leave my last 2 minutes to Cora.
Yes, so just a very quick sort of whistle-stop tour. As Allison mentioned, the SHaME Festival is a multi-year collaboration. So we work with Women of the World Foundation as a research project, but this year, in 2 days actually, we're going to Rio de Janeiro. Researchers flew out yesterday, I'm not jealous at all. And we're working there in collaboration with an organisation called Hedges for Mare, which is a community organisation who work in the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, across the sort of 16 favelas, over 140,000 people living there, to try to work on creating effective policies to work with people who live in the area. So I guess what I just kind of briefly wanted to walk you through was this sort of dynamics or particular considerations around sort of planning an event or doing public history internationally as part of a wider project. So the main kind of theme of the next few minutes is kind of questions of ownership. So for us, obviously, well, for me, first of all, coming in, I'm maternity cover, so I'm taking over a project that really wasn't born with me at all. And crucially, which has a longer history. But I'm also, as I say, working with an organisation in Rio, and it's really their baby. The main thing we didn't want to do was sort of parachute in as a research project in London and say, we're going to do this festival for you. Anything like that. The main thing we're kind of doing is providing a bit of a sort of template of the lessons that we learned from Shameless London and providing the funding, mediating with Welcome who provide our sort of main funding, and then facilitating bits of that. So 3 of our researchers are over there speaking. So that was sort of the ownership of the project really is theirs. And one of the crucial steps in allowing that or making that happen was we have a producer who is Brazilian and lives in London, who is sort of a bridge, I guess, between those projects, organisations and worlds. So a huge amount, she's done absolutely huge amounts of work for the project. So I guess that's something I really wanted to emphasise. Another thing was just, obviously, if you're collaborating across countries, across organisations, you have to be very sensitive of things like differences in working practices. Which, you know, as historians, public or otherwise, working with a large NGO or a community kind of organisation in Rio, you're going to get different expectations of events, of kind of projects. So it's really important, I guess, we felt from a very, very early stage, which planning for this project started a couple of years ago at least, to just lay out expectations and then be adaptable. And sort of responsive to needs on the ground, to organisational needs, etc. The other thing to sort of bear in mind is obviously, as I say, we were kind of operating on a bit of a template that we'd established at Shameless London, but really we had to be very sensitive to differences in sexual violence, gender-based violence, etc. in Brazil and in Rio. You know, the kind of panels or examples of sexual violence that we were using in the London context didn't necessarily fit with the Brazilian context. So the programme really kind of developed specifically in response to Hedges and to the women and people that we were working with there. But one of the things we sort of wanted to do was be aware of who was already working in the area and in the place. be sensitive to sort of what their needs were and ongoing sort of collaborations starting out. You know, we didn't want to come in, do something, and then leave again, rather than building effective collaborations with them and sort of helping lay groundwork for future projects. So a lot of SHaME is really about building ongoing relationships. I'm massively running over, but obviously feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. I think we'll agree there's some really exciting and important public history work going on. I'm afraid we have 15 minutes for questions. It still isn't a great deal, so I could ask if your question is more a lengthy comment, perhaps save that for lunch. And I'd also like to ask our speakers if they have any questions for each other. That would be amazing as well. So, questions? Yes, sorry.
I've got a question for you, Kit. I was just wondering, because we were saying a lot of the time we do collaborations and it's often like a one-off type deal. I was wondering if you ran into the same situation where, you know, people call you and they're like, oh, do you want to do this? And then once that's done, that's kind of it.
I related so hard to you being like, who really want to pay us no workers in 1 month of the year? LGBT History Month is exactly the same problem. So, yes. It's interesting, I went to an event, some of you might also have been there, a Zoom event about like doing queer work in regional museums as opposed to national museums last week, and some of the speakers there were saying that they now don't do projects unless there's going to be some sort of sustainable commitment from the organisation they're working with. And it was really interesting for me to hear that because I've never felt entitled to ask that of an organisation. I think because I've been doing this for quite a long time, and it's, you know, initially I was just really grateful to have work, and you might kind of feel like you're in a similar position. But I'm really thinking about that now, about next time I go into working with an organisation, talking about what is the legacy of this. You know, partly to make doing this a sustainable career, but also partly to make sure that it's not something that an organisation just does to tick a box and then move on, which, yeah, people like to do. So, yes, I do find that, and I'm thinking about how to manage it in the future, but I don't have any sort of stories of where I've said, yeah, this has to be sustainable, and someone's gone, okay, great, it means we'll commit to, you know, I haven't experienced that yet. What are your experiences with that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the same. Black History Month rolls around and we get just inundated with people asking us to come in and do workshops, do presentations, do X, Y, Z. I think now we said that if you want us, you've got to pay us.
And the overwork is not to be underestimated.
And I think as well, we're looking a bit more carefully at what exactly we're doing, because before it was like, great, people want us to speak, let's go. And we've actually gone to some events and been like, why are we even here, sort of thing. And I think Tionne, you could probably speak a lot to that more than I could, but definitely there's been some times where we've definitely just been there just for the sake of it.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Parris said. I think one of the things though that we didn't mention in our presentation is that we are really, well, it's a double-sided kind of thing. We're really lucky because we work with the Black Cultural Archives, who have been really great partners for us, and that we have members go to their archives and sort of catalogue everything that we've gone through. So there's a permanent sort of space for the work that we do, as well as that our website is a sort of a living archive where we add things to often, whatever resources or whatever else we've been up to. But I think outside of that, it does mean that we are quite, I guess, limited in terms of the long-term kind of things that we do. Like I said, the Black Cultural Archives have been really good for us. Other institutions as well, the George Padmore Institute is really good for us in terms of being open to us and being willing to collaborate. I think we've had mixed kind of collaborations with the National Archives, but again, that's kind of political, and then it sort of depends on whatever's going on publicly at the time. But again, like I said, we do have some little pockets of places where we can count on that sort of ongoing collaboration, and that really, like you said, trustworthy kind of interaction with organisations.
So you mentioned the National Archives, but the issue is a lot of the time when we do work with archives, and especially the National Archive, because it's a Home Office body, there are certain documents potentially that you might want that are withheld, and there are certain archives that are quite exclusive. For example, Birmingham Archive, one of our members tried to visit Birmingham, and they're not an academic student at all, but the Birmingham Archive went back to them and said, you need to be doing a PhD, you need two references, academic references, you need 2 academic references, and yeah, come back to us, and then you can get in. So there's a lot of those sort of barriers we face in terms of even just trying to do our basic research.
Yeah, and whilst we do have people in the group that are doing PhDs, we don't want to kind of use that as a key to get in. We want everyone to be able to access the history, and especially with young black people, we want them to be able to access their own history and to because that person as well is from Birmingham, so he was really keen to go see whatever was in the archive, and he was told, no, you're not in education, you're not an academic, and when there's less than 1% of black academics in history anyway, that is a huge barrier for us. So we've kind of had a back and forth with a lot of archives in that sense to say, well, why is it this way though? It's our history, we should be allowed to look at it.
Was there a question at the back?
Well, it's kind of building on what you're saying. I'm just interested in that idea that those collaborations, and I'm obviously working in the national station. Some of the ways, a project I've been working with is lots of regional partners. So there's been really successful projects of those collaborations with in different regions. But I'm interested to know how how you would build a long sustainable. What is your, how would you be interested to work? Is it about going into those organisations and developing a kind of research type public engagement project with them, or is it that you're looking at a particular area, so then you're identifying who you want to work with, rather than how does that kind of work in terms of how you develop your ideas and projects?
I think in terms of long term, a lot of our success can be found with schools, and in terms of going into schools and doing workshops, we always get really, really good feedback, and obviously we're not asking the school to necessarily pay us out the nose for our involvement, but having that sort of relationship where, okay, we've been to the school once, we know the sort of lay of the land, and they invite us back next year, they invite us back maybe even next month, they invite us just to be around and get involved with the students. I think the schools area is a place that long-term relationships are quite good at being built, especially because that's essentially our target audience.
And I would add to that, in terms of organisations themselves or institutions, whilst we do want to engage with them and we do want to kind of widen that participation in our history, we also aren't super reliant on it, because we do all of our work kind of in-house, and we create our own resources and we have our own archives, etc. And also our approach is two-pronged, so it's not only to have public engagement with our history and kind of make that more, widespread thing that people care about. We also are trying to develop historians who will go off after they leave YHP for whatever reason. They will go off and they will spread that history in other ways. So we've got multiple kind of ways that we're approaching this.
I was just going to say, it's a testament to the fact that how effective YHP is, and I'm not trying to blow YHP too much, but I think how many YHP members are doing PhDs?
Quite a few.
So there's a few.
I think 3, 4, maybe 5.
So yeah, and that number, when you look at the overall statistics, having 5 black historians doing PhDs in a climate where history is the 3rd most important subject among black students, I think it's a real bonus.